All right, thank you all so much for coming to this session. We plan to have a very lively conversation and really explore some of what we know about the broader context for retreat, and hopefully even question some of our assumptions that might be relevant to talks we've heard across this riveting week. But since it's Friday and it's been an invigorating, but yes, a long week, we thought we'd start with a little bit of a story and a cartoon. So Quentin put this cartoon on our family chat thread yesterday, end of day. Quentin is not a floodplain manager. He instead installs pool fences in Florida, which for reasons we're going to see is a really lucrative business. But this just came across his social media thread and he thought it was funny, so he put it out there for us. So why might someone like Quentin be thinking about this cartoon and find it funny? Well, most of the time we think about this issue after the context of disaster, and he lives in a part of Florida that was just spared as Hurricane Ian roared through. He also thinks about it a lot, given what's happening around us in the state. He lives right next to a major open space preserve that was just converted for a 1,000 single family home development, and it's Florida. So when they were drilling the well for these 1,000 homes, a massive sinkhole opened up and collapsed in the area. So these really are not hypothetical issues. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the policy wonk details, the nuances of research behind this broader context for thinking about retreat. But I think it's really, really important to recognize that the public does not only think about these issues in the aftermath of disaster. This is really part of our ongoing awareness that speaks to the importance of this conference in this moment. Okay, so cartoon aside, but still we're actually going to refer to panels of this cartoon. What is the premise for this session? This is the premise. Most of the time, when we think about managed retreat, we have made it through all of these different stages of the cartoon. There's been housing and infrastructure placed in a hazardous area. Historically, you might say, well, that hazardous area wasn't even mapped yet, so people didn't really know how hazardous it was. Increasingly, though, that's not really an excuse for all the reasons we are familiar with. That infrastructure and housing has gone into a hazardous location, then there's a flood, maybe another flood, maybe yet another flood. And at some point, people realize the damages are just too great. And at different scales, as we've been exploring across this week, retreat occurs. Okay, so now to build from that premise of that being when we most of the time consider managed retreat, what we're going to do here is say, you know, maybe there are some communities that didn't advance to stage 2. In this cartoon. They preserved open space. They avoided developing in the floodplain. And so what we're going to do through a phenomenal set of panelists here is to zoom out and to see what it means to put retreat into context. If we consider the places that have avoided developing in the floodplain, do we learn something different about land use planning, affordable housing, floodplain management overall? So what we'll do is I will briefly introduce our phenoms across the stage here. We will then hear from Siders, who will introduce, I'll introduce her more in a second, but some research we've been doing, building from this premise of putting retreat into context. We'll hear reactions across the panel to some of these results, and then you'll hear from each one of them in turn. We have about 3 or 4 sets of questions paired up for the panel, but we're hopefully going to have plenty of time for your questions, so save up your questions and get ready. Okay, so our first speaker will be Professor A.R. Siders. Siders is a professor at the University of Delaware. She is a deeply interdisciplinary scholar, as you can see from the range of affiliations she has. Her professorship is associated with the Disaster Research Center, the Biden School of Public Policy, and the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences. She's trained as both a lawyer and an adaptation researcher, which you will see. And she also directs the University of Delaware Climate Change Science and Policy Hub. After Siders gives her opening remarks, we will next hear from Vince Mazzei. Vince is the first state floodplain manager in New Jersey, affiliated with New Jersey's Department of Environmental Protection. He has really deep experience in flood risk assessment and mitigation, as is the case for the next speaker as well. He is trained in the engineering sciences and has many accolades associated with that area of expertise. He has been central in the development of multiple pillars of regulation and law in the New Jersey flood management context. For example, the very stringent rules under the New Jersey Flood Hazard Area Control Act and the more ongoing regulatory reforms aiming to bring climate change into environmental regulations. Then, zooming up in our spatial scales of governance here, we will next hear from John Miller. John is associated with FEMA Region 2, and as we have heard again and again this week about the importance of integration and coordination, that is really his mission. He is part of FEMA's integration team, embedded within New Jersey's Office of Emergency Management as a risk adaptation resource to the state to help improve coordination. He also is a longtime practicing engineer and certified floodplain manager with deep expertise also in the community rating system, very relevant to the scope of what we'll discuss today. Then we'll next hear from Eric Letvin, and if you have been at any of the sessions this week, probably he needs absolutely no introduction at this point. He is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mitigation at FEMA. He directs the pre- and post-disaster mitigation programs that we know so well, BRIC, HMGMP, many programs under the National Flood Insurance Program like CRS and other flood mitigation efforts. Before FEMA, he was at the White House. He too has an interdisciplinary background in environmental engineering and law. Last but absolutely not least, we will hear from Professor Linda Shai. Linda is a professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell. She's one of the world's preeminent experts in urban climate adaptation and land governance, thinking about the way so many different factors intersect to shape outcomes for social justice as well as environmental sustainability. Before becoming a professor at Cornell, she had a very large range of experiences in public, private, think tank experiences really around the world, and I think she brings that richness to almost every remark she makes. Okay, so first we will turn to Professor A.R. Siders, who will introduce some of the research results towards this mission of putting retreat into context.
I don't think we all have to stand up. I just won't remember what my slides are unless I have them here, so thanks. All right, thanks everyone. So as Katie already mentioned, we're trying to put this in context, right? So if we think, we all know, facing major coastal floods, how do we think, what are our options, right? We tend to categorize them this way. We can resist, try to hold back the water. We can accommodate, try to live with the water. We can avoid, not build there in the first place, and we can retreat after we've already done that, right? And we're thinking a lot about these last two. How do we avoid? And we wanted to look into where is avoidance happening, right? And how is it happening? How is it related to retreat? And before we move on, how many of you think that the US is doing a pretty good job of floodplain avoidance? Cool. All right. Just want to establish that because this is the surprise. Actually, we think it is. Yeah. So we created a, oh, thanks. I wasn't realizing that. So, well, actually, I'm taking a lot of credit for what Miyuki Hino and Armin Agopian and Katie Mock have done. I just get to be the presenter of this. So created two different metrics of thinking about floodplain avoidance at a national level, at a municipal scale, right? So thinking about community levels and looking at changes in impervious surface and changes in the number of housing units that have been built from like basically 2000 to 2019, right? So 2-decade time period. And looking at how much of that new development of any type or of housing specifically has gone into the floodplain. And the answer is, I mean, a lot of it has gone into the floodplain. So this is a major challenge. On the other hand, 76% of communities across the United States are doing better than you'd expect. They're keeping things out of the floodplain. They're doing a pretty good job. And I actually think this is a really important shift in the narrative. And I think about this because I was talking to someone else yesterday who's helping me put this more diplomatically. So if you're in that 24%, you are in the minority scenario and you should feel bad. Okay? But I think it shifts the narrative. It is no longer a narrative of everyone is struggling to develop in the floodplain. Everyone is like, this is an insolvable problem, right? There's so much tax revenue. There's so many things going on here that of course towns are building in the floodplain. Actually, 76% are not, right? So if you are in the 24% who are, you aren't the norm. You are failing. You are not doing something that 76% of your compatriots have figured out how to do. Okay, so I actually think this is a really important shift in the narrative, which is why we're so excited about some of these findings. We zoomed into New Jersey because we figured if any place in the US at a state level was facing really strong development pressures, was going to have a hard time avoiding floodplain development, we thought it would be New Jersey. So we zoomed in into New Jersey, and you can see the scale here, right? Only 14% of communities in New Jersey have disproportionately put housing in the floodplain. And you can see where they are. Not surprisingly, some of them are along the coast, right? I mean, maybe my face is a bit in the way, but some of them are up here near New York, right? And the ones that are outlined are towns where we went in and we did a deep dive. So we picked some towns that were developing in a floodplain and some towns that were not developing in the floodplain. And we went in to do a deep dive. We looked at 23 different legal and regulatory tools that the town could be using. We thought to try to do avoidance, to figure out which ones are they actually using. We did interviews with them to figure out how are they using them, what the quality. We did a big scoring. I see Tess and Ching, and I think Lydia's here somewhere online, like all helped score and code a lot of these documents. What's the quality of them on paper, and then how well are they being implemented? And what was, again, kind of surprising is that they're not using anything really exciting. They're not using any major legal innovations. They haven't done anything cutting edge. They just have some zoning laws, some of them, not even all of them, right? They have some zoning laws. They've used some transfer development. They've conserved some open space. But the important thing is they've implemented their laws. And the thing that we thought was kind of exciting about this is that when we started picking places like Aberdeen, for example, Aberdeen has had very little development in the floodplain. Even when we went to Aberdeen, they said, I don't know why you're here. We're not doing anything really exceptional. And I said, well, that's interesting because you have more tools for floodplain management than any other town in your county. They're like, we do. What? I didn't know that. That's interesting. We're like, oh, we're not doing really well. All we do is we're a really well-oiled machine, was their quote. We're a really well-oiled machine and we just enforce our laws and we don't let businesses push us around. And I'm like, taking notes. Like, that's actually very interesting. As opposed to, like, I'll pick on Weehawken for a moment, right? Who's currently in litigation for 6 lawsuits because they have allegedly rewritten their entire code to allow development to occur not only near the water, but in front of the rebuild by design levee. Yeah, floodplain isn't even part of the lawsuit. They're just about the town not enforcing its code. So comparatively, right? Who's doing well and who's not? It's not some magical silver bullet. It's just having some pretty basic laws on the books and then enforcing them consistently over time. But one of the stories is that places like Aberdeen that have done well sort of all along, it's kind of a prodigal son story, are maybe not getting the same attention as places like Woodbridge that didn't do so well, got slammed in Hurricane Sandy, and is now reforming and doing better and doing a much better job of thinking about floodplain avoidance and retreat. And so it was interesting in that when we talked to people about, like, where should we go study, right? We often heard, like, oh, go to Woodbridge, go to these places that have sort of reformed their legal codes, as opposed to the places that had done well all the time, because they're just not seen as doing well, right? We were told, oh, Aberdeen, they just got lucky. They still have their tidal wetlands. No one else has their tidal wetlands. Thought, do you wonder why they still have their tidal wetlands and everyone else has still them in to build them? And it's interesting to try and shift this story of, is that a fluke that they still have their tidal wetlands, or is that because they did something well in the first place? To Katie's comic, right? They avoided that first step of filling it in. So we're really interested in this. Oh, this is just a summary of, you can see that the number of tools isn't actually all that impressive. Like I said, we looked at 23 different tools. So even the best town only had 11 out of 23. So it's not adopting a ton. More important is that you can see the towns that did better in green there have high quality or medium quality tools. So they had some higher quality tools. I can talk about how we scored that if anyone's actually really interested in the nuances of that, but they had higher quality, more strict tools on the books. And then the implementation, right, the effectiveness of that, they had high quality. Woodbridge thought a lot of theirs were high quality, but we think that's because they have, like, adopted new tools, and we think they were talking about their new tools having very high quality. So we think that might be a bit of a timing issue there. So I think that's it. I'm going to put it back on the New Jersey slide because we wanted to let our panelists react to some of that reaction. I think that's it. Yeah. And Katie can fill in anything I missed.
Okay, thank you so much, Siders. So we heard a few main conclusions from Siders on this work, right? And a lot of this is pushing against some of the assumptions we might make. So her assertion number 1 is, maybe we are actually better at avoiding development in the floodplain than we might guess. We're at least doing better than random chance. You could say the baseline should be 0, but we are at least doing better than random chance. Number 2, she asserted that sometimes we might be missing the actual success stories, not really getting that a place like Aberdeen and being so proactive had that proactive intervention that led to much better outcomes down the road. And then her third provocation here, not that surprising as a lawyer, is that we probably have the legal and regulatory tools we need. We just need to do better in applying them. So before we go to the formal rounds from each of the panelists, I want to just kind of open it up for initial reactions, if anything jumps to mind, having heard these slides from Vince, Eric, Linda, and John.
Vince, you're the floodplain manager. Let's go.
Okay, no pressure. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah, well, so it is really interesting, having worked at DEP for 35 years in New Jersey and being involved with hundreds or thousands of different projects across the state and writing regulations for the state. There is a vast difference from community to community. So this doesn't surprise me. And it's complex. These are of course factors that are the primary ones, but if you're in a community like Plainfield, New Jersey, where the vast majority of the community is in a FEMA mapped floodplain, your development patterns there and like where you put your affordable housing or where you put multi-residence buildings, or if you're building a hospital that has to have access to the community, that's going to look different than a community where maybe only 1 or 2% of the town is in a floodplain. And so, you know, we see that dynamic. We see along the coast where 100% of the town is in a floodplain, and parts of the state where it's not like that. So that's a factor as well. You know, obviously the development pressure is enormous. Anything that can be developed is somebody's going to try to develop it. The fact in New Jersey, one thing too, is that a lot of times and I guess this is pretty common, is that your freshwater wetlands complexes are usually concurrent with or associated with flood hazard areas. And so we have robust laws in New Jersey through the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act that restrict development in those areas. So that also kind of has a corollary impact on development in the flood hazard areas, but it's very complex. And you know, this doesn't surprise me at all.
I just want to react because I realized, like I said, I'm speaking for Miyuki, and so Miyuki, I apologize for the way I presented this, but I should clarify one thing is that these are actually relative measures. So this is relative to the amount of development that has occurred and relative to the size of the floodplain. So the way I think about this is you take a map and then you throw monopoly houses on it, right? If 20% of the map is in the floodplain, then 20% of my monopoly houses should end up in the floodplain. And when Katie said doing better than random chance, that's what she's saying is like, if you're doing better than random chance, you've pushed houses out of the floodplain. And if you're doing worse than random chance, you've pushed them into the floodplain. So any community up here in green has pushed them out of the floodplain, and any community in red has pushed them into the floodplain. The other thing you mentioned is the state role, right? The wetlands regulations and things. I think that's an area we're hoping to take this analysis next, because I think one of the big questions we have is what is the role of the state in pushing some of these local governments to do better, or the feds. Yeah, but what's the role of this, or economics, private sector, any of this, right? What's the role of this in pushing these states or these communities to do better? Just realized I should clarify that. I forgot.
Yeah, Miyuki's had a family emergency this week and unfortunately has not been able to be here. If she were here, she can really do the technical details of what she has achieved. Eric, if I was observing correctly, you were the only person in the entire room who put your hand up when Siders asked it whether we were doing avoidance well. Do you want to reflect on what was going through your head?
I was, you know, a little surprised, but when I thought about it, maybe not really. I mean, we know a couple things. So we have, I'm responsible for the mitigation grants, but also floodplain management. So we have 3 legs of the stool of the National Flood Insurance Program. We have mapping, we have flood insurance, and we have the minimum standards that all communities that that adopt the maps and sell flood insurance, they have to adhere to those minimum standards. They have to have an ordinance. They have to, any structures that are permitted in the floodplain have to follow those minimum standards. They have to follow their ordinance. We actually, I don't know if a lot of people know this, we spend a lot of time and energy not only providing assistance to communities, to local floodplain managers, but we actually do compliance audits. We drive the floodplain, we go in and we pull permits and we see how well they're doing. And if a community is not doing a good job, or we had a county in Colorado that basically just stopped following their floodplain ordinance, we put them on probation. And then probation could lead to suspension. And when you're suspended, not only do you, citizens are not available to receive any flood insurance, that county is no longer able to receive any federal disaster assistance, not just from FEMA, but any federal agency. So that is kind of a big outcome when communities don't adhere to their minimum standards. Right now, I should mention that you know, Rob Moore and Anna are in the audience. We did receive a petition. We haven't updated those minimum standards in 40 years. And we've learned a lot in 40 years. And so we're in the process of reviewing. We had a request for information, like how should those minimum standards change with all the climate science that we understand right now. So we are looking at that and potentially changing those minimum standards. The one thing I don't know how much we can take credit for this. I'd like to think that this has something to do with the outcome that you just shared. Is we have the community rating system. I don't know how many people. This quick show of hands. How many people know what the community rating system is? Okay, a little over half. So that's our incentive program. So we have the minimum standards. The community rating system are things that a community can do to minimize the impact in the floodplain. And our actuaries will look at those different, there's a book like this thick, there's things that give credit for every 500 points, you get a 5% reduction in flood insurance. That's pretty attractive. And so we have a number of communities. We have, I think, roughly 23,000 communities in the National Flood Insurance Program. And about 1,500 of those communities are in the CRS. That represents 70% of all flood insurance policyholders. So the vast majority of policyholders live in a community that is adopting some kind of incentive for reducing flood losses. And I can get into it a little bit later. There's different credits for preserving open space and acquiring properties in the floodplains. So when I was on the stage yesterday, I said that, we don't have a preference with the grants, whether they elevate or acquire or rebuild in place, as long as they follow their local hazard plan. That's true. But the CRS program, I think, is our incentive program. So having, 70% of the policyholders, and we have only, for academics out there, we have only 1 or 2 peer-reviewed studies that actually show the effectiveness of the CRS on reducing losses. So I don't want to take too much credit because there's not a lot of research there, but I'd like to think that has something to do with it.
Well, actually, I think, Katie, I don't remember the stats.
I can do
results.
it. Yeah.
good.
Just was reviewing this on my way to New York. Okay. So Eric, you're going to have a third peer reviewed paper shortly, hopefully. So we indeed looked at CRS participating communities with respect to these different measures of development versus housing development in the floodplain. And what we found was that participation in CRS was not where we saw improvement in development. It was the communities that had improving CRS scores. So if you're in CRS and you're decreasing through time, not making a difference. If you're in CRS and improving through time, unsurprisingly, we're seeing improvement in terms of those patterns of development.
So we're not sure how much of it is CRS, but we know it is making, or we think it's making a difference.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'd like to think that it does. And as part of, just as part of, we have a new rating system, risk rating 2.0. We are going to be over the next several years redoing CRS completely based on the new rate structure. So the way we have CRS now, that is going to change. We will have new credits and new weights and what have you. So hopefully we'll take a lot of the science and things that we're learning here and help rebuild CRS and make it even more effective than it is today.
Well, that'll be cool eventually to compare baseline like this against future.
Great. Linda or John, would you like to offer any reactions to these data?
Yeah, I don't want to be, I want to be let back to New Jersey. So please, let's keep that in the room. FEMA has a new tracker. It's the National Violation Tracker. So when I see this, I'm like, that's good. The National Violation Tracker shows something completely different. 17,000 structures in New Jersey are in violation. Most of those are negatively rated structures, meaning that their lowest floor is below the base flood elevation. Just to give some context of this, New Jersey is only second to Florida in terms of the number of properties that are in violation. So we have that to work with too. I think you need to understand New Jersey through time too, is a lot of the development in New Jersey has already taken place. We have a lot of older communities. We have, maybe the shoreline is going back to, post World War II, but we have a lot of cities, a lot of municipalities that experienced their growth quite a long time ago. And I think that needs to be part of the story here. Going on the CRS, there's a good story, I think, and I'm glad to hear someone's looking at New Jersey's CRS participation. About 100 communities participate in CRS in New Jersey out of 565 municipalities in New Jersey. 562, I think, is the number that participate in the national, a very, very high number. But there is like, I call it, good peer pressure going on in New Jersey, and there has been for a while. And a good example of that is in Cape May County, where Avalon, New Jersey got into the CRS program. Stone Harbor to its south said, they're getting a discount. What's going on there? They got into it. Sea City, that's north of the north town of Avalon, got into the program. They had a lot of violations. They addressed those violations, and then they really soared into the CRS program But that's going on in New Jersey. There's these collective areas where there's this, again, I call it positive peer pressure of participation. So there's a lot to say. There's been a lot of storms in New Jersey too. I think we all talk about Sandy. Sandy was just the big event, but there were numerous. You can go to, you can go to Floyd, and just in your time period of what you're studying, Floyd in 1999, you can go to the Delaware River in 2004, 2005, 2006, then you shoot up into, the Raritan River Basin, the Passaic River Basin, 2007, 2011. Then you had Sandy in 2012. We've certainly had Ida more recently in 2021, I believe. It's just been like one after the next. And while Sandy was, an order of magnitude bigger than any of these things probably combined, people are getting the message. Nature's teaching here in the state. So I think you're seeing some of the results of that as well. Just one quick comment on Woodbridge. I always talk about, why are certain communities doing well? And I was a CRS coordinator volunteer in my own town. You need a champion in your town is kind of what I come up with. And Woodbridge has the mayor as a champion. He is absolutely behind these buyouts and doing some incredible things in Woodbridge, has that vision, has that long-term goal, which I think a lot of leadership lacks at the municipal level, but Woodbridge has it, and they're a great case study.
Yeah, and being the person who is on the ground in Woodbridge doing validation of every single metric we came up, it was a really interesting story that I think connects with what you were saying earlier, John, where they had a lot of conversion of the industrial waterfront about 2 decades ago. So that made them kind of moderate in the development here. But as John emphasized and decided to emphasize, truly massive scale of open space restoration post Sandy, and the close linkage between their floodplain manager and their mayor seemed to be the whole story of that town. Linda, do you want to jump in with any reactions?
Sure. I'm not a New Jersey expert, so I'm not going to love or hate on New Jersey. I was wondering if you could put up the national map just so, those from other states might really look at their states and what's going on there. I first want to just really applaud you guys on doing this study. I think it's so much, it's an academic tendency to study and critique. And so when you critique, you study things that are problematic, and there's a kind of a limit as to how much that study can actually do for you, because you learn what's not working and you can maybe guess what could be working, but you can't actually prove what works or not. And so I really like that you are turning this on its head and studying what is working and where. I also, as a planning professor, really appreciate that what you're basically saying is that planning works. Which we don't usually have that message.
Headline takeaway.
I've been stumping the people with this question of like, what are you proud of about American planning systems? It's like, oh, I don't know. Apparently our floodplain management, shockingly. So I think that's a really interesting message as well. But kind of building on what John was saying, I think that there's a question here about causality, and you have kind of put your thumbs on the scale that it is the planning piece that is influencing these outcomes. And I would maybe broaden the possibilities as to what other factors there are. So America has 25,000 local governments. So most of them are very, very small. And I'd be curious if you were to overlay a map of where the population centers are. I would think that the largest population centers are quite closely connected to where the red spots are showing up. I mean, it's almost like a political map of the red and blue could be something that looks like this. So similar to what you're saying is like, what are the development pressures? What is the age in which these places were built? And what was the period of development? A lot of the older cities, they were all built out before any CRS or FEMA or really land use guidance or even planning as a field and zoning laws were implemented. I'd be curious about the size of the municipality and whether the kind of land constraints would affect the ability of a municipality to say, I will forego development along the rivers and the floodplains and the coast because I have so much other land. And there also is a geographic distribution as to where you have smaller size municipalities. In the West, you have much bigger municipalities. In the East and the Northeast, you have much smaller ones. So as you were saying, a lot of municipalities, your entire city is in a floodplain. those cities by nature are going to do much more poorly. And so there, it's not necessarily what your planner's choices are going to be. It might be some other structural factors. I'd be curious, like, and then, yeah, so, and then I guess lastly, it's like the amount of development that is happening in the places that are red versus the places that are green. So even if the percentage as a relative figure is better, but then if the number of buildings going into the floodplain far exceeds the number that are not going in the green areas, then this may also be a challenge. So even some of Professor Hino's other work shows, like for every one house that is bought out in North Carolina, another 4 houses get built in the floodplain. It might not necessarily reflect on this map, but it's actually like a bigger problem for FEMA to deal with down the road.
Yeah, and I noted that CIDRS was taking down each of those factors. Some of them we've looked at. And so, for example, for a lot of them, we're seeing a kind of a U-shaped pattern where the lower income municipalities are seeing especially more housing units going to into the floodplain. That decreases with level of wealth until it takes a big uptick on the other end of the spectrum, kind of a very different nature of, is your flood hazard backwaters with a lot of mosquitoes, or that coastal amenity, which then tends to trump prudence around flood risk. Okay, thank you so much. What we are going to do now is to turn to each of our panelists and really have them reflect on their own context. How has retreat from their perspective been situated in these broader contexts of land use and flood risk management? How has it been integrated together or not with avoidance, protection, accommodation, and other measures? Some of them have slides, and Vince, who will be kicking us off here, especially has a number of slides. So if you like, Vince, you can come up here, or I can advance for you. And let's see. Okay, perfect. So you can use.
I'll come up so I can see what I,
Yeah.
thank you. All right, let's see. Oh, that is my slide. Okay. So, kind of building on what John had said before, New Jersey, we're blessed with a lot of waterways, and most of the colonial settlements that occurred over the last couple hundred years were on waterways, because waterways were the navigable, the means of transportation and commerce and whatnot. So pretty much every town center in New Jersey has a stream in it, and every stream has a floodplain. And so a lot of the development that we've inherited from, decisions that were made in past generations are in flood hazard areas, and they were often made irrespective of the flood risk, because they either didn't know it or they didn't understand it. And how do we even assess flood risk, right? The first place we go is our FEMA flood maps, right? They're a great tool, a great resource. They're flood insurance rate maps, so they're intended to tell insurers how much insurance to apply, or what rate to apply to an insured building. So the problem, though, and we've seen this in New Jersey over and over again, is that the flood doesn't know that it's supposed to stop at that line on the map. And many, many floods have gone beyond that. And so we have a lot of communities where Ida was a good example, where people were completely outside the flood zone, not required by their lender to have flood insurance, because there's no requirement to have flood insurance unless your lender requires you to do so. And they're just looking at the FEMA map. And I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think in Ida, at least a quarter of the flood insurance claims were for folks that were outside the map flood hazard area. So a quarter of the claims came from people that didn't even need to have flood insurance, but just happened to have it. I have these conversations with my family all the time, where anybody in my family that's anywhere near a floodplain, I'm like, please get flood insurance. You're not gonna go wrong with this. The problem, though, with relying on FEMA maps as our starting point is that, of course, necessarily they look at past hydrology, they look at past floods, they look at past events, and it's data that's been collected over decades. And so it doesn't reflect in New Jersey case, it doesn't seem to reflect today's actual flood conditions, and it certainly doesn't include anything related to climate change. So it's not generally a sound methodology for predicting where the floods are going to be completely in the future, is what we found. And there were 2 studies that kind of supported this. One was a study DEP partnered with the Northeast Regional Climate Center, and it looked at the precipitation trends in New Jersey, and specifically over about a 20-year period from 1999 to the year 2021. Now, when I'm a civil engineer, if I'm designing a site, I'm looking at the National Weather Service has precipitation tables, and I'm calculating runoff, and I'm figuring out how much, based on how much rain should be expected at this location, how much runoff there will be, and so on. But what we found is that the data that the National Weather Service is using was last updated in 1999. So when people are designing today, they're really not designing for today's conditions. They're designing for the 1999 conditions. And what we saw was alarming, that depending where you were in the state, and you can see, the northern counties were hit harder than this, that just from 1999 to 2021, there were some counties where the 100-year precipitation, the 1% chance precipitation, increased as much as 15% just in that 20-year period. And this was, we saw this in Ida. For example, there's a USGS gauge along the Raritan River in Bound Brook. And that gauge has shown that the 500-year flood, the 0.2% chance flood, has been exceeded 3 times since 1999. So if you're having 3 500-year floods in a 3-year period, there's an issue with the relationship between what the mapping shows and what's actually happening on the ground. So then projecting forward, this trend continues, and in some counties by the end of the century, there's a likelihood that there could be as much as 50% increases in precipitation intensity. So in other words, if you're expecting 10 inches of rain during a 100-year event or a 1% event, now you're going to have 15 inches. Where's that water going to go? And obviously more rain means more runoff, and more runoff means more water getting to streams and creeks and rivers. And the streams and creeks and rivers were designed, they've formed over thousands of years to carry a certain amount of water. And now they're being asked to carry a lot more water. And that's why we see a lot of erosion. The road I live on fell into the creek that was near our house. And even though my house is not in a floodplain, because that'd be too ironic. My house and my road in front of my house is not in a floodplain. And I looked at all the maps and did the calculations and everything, but it never occurred to me that upstream and downstream of my house, that the road was in the floodplain, and the road was destroyed on both ends. And we couldn't get to or from our house for 3 days because of that, even though we were safe. And if we had a medical emergency, if we had, we lost power, I have a generator, but what if I didn't have a generator? I have small kids, what would have happened? And we saw that there were fatalities in Ida because people couldn't be reached during floods. And so this is a huge thing. And the trends are just showing that it's just getting progressively more complex and dangerous. And then my last slide, just looking at, not precipitation driven flooding, but sea level rise along the coast. New Jersey kind of has a double whammy. First of all, we're experiencing higher than average sea level rise to begin with along the Jersey coast, but also portions of New Jersey are subject to subsidence. The ground is actually sinking. So when you put those two things together, you have this table that Rutgers University put together in 2019. And it shows, you can see, it shows like different planning horizons, 2030, 2050, 2070, and it shows different likelihoods that sea level will exceed certain elevations. And so the first step we did in New Jersey is to say, well, things that are being built today are likely to be serviceable, buildings, houses, whatnot, 50, 75, 100 years from now. So we picked the year 2100 as our planning horizon. So we want things in New Jersey not only designed to be safe today, but to be safe for the anticipated conditions that would occur in 2100 based on our studies. And we assumed moderate emissions levels. There's a lot of variability in these studies. And we initially started out with the 50%, the median value. And we said, okay, there's a median chance that 3.3 feet of sea level rise will be experienced along the Jersey coast by the end of the century. So let's make people build 3.3 feet higher. But if you think about what I just said, there's a 50% chance that could be exceeded. So what we would actually be doing in that case is saying to somebody, build 3.3 feet higher, and there's only a 50% chance that it's high enough. And that's not good odds. So what we've done is we've gone to the high end of the likely range, which is the 17% exceedance interval. So there's a 17% probability that sea level rise would exceed 5.1 feet along the New Jersey coast. So as a result of all these studies, what we've done is we're adding to FEMA maps. If someone wants to use a FEMA map to develop, they have to add 2 feet to it, or 3 feet to it actually, in non-tidal areas. And they will next year, when we adopt their regulations, have to build 5 feet higher than the FEMA flood elevation. So as you can imagine, communities are, we have a lot of mixed emotions about that. You know, we've had a lot of conversations with people that in local governments that say, well, this is never going to happen. You're just costing us, you're making people spend a lot of money for something that'll never happen. And I'm like, well, the studies show this, you know, so we have to overcome that. And then we have people saying, well, if we're really going to get 5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, our barrier islands are going to be underwater. And so why make anybody do anything? We're going to have to abandon it anyway. So I'm like, no, you know, that's not how it works. You know, we need to be safe. We need to make sure that development is prepared for that. You know, so New Jersey has a lot of complex issues. We talk about this all day, but that's just kind of a quick overview.
Wonderful. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vince. John, we'll go to you next and I will get your slide queued up.
I'll stay where
Perfect.
and I don't know how, Vince, how'd you get 3 slides? We were told 1 slide.
Snuck them in.
Yeah, right. All right. I'll talk about this in a second. Weighing the avoidance versus retreat, I would say from the New Jersey standpoint, I'd say the state plays a very heavy role in the avoidance, where the municipalities play surprisingly a lesser role. And I'll mention why. The state has its own floodplain, it has its own regulations. So anyone that triggers a certain rule, which is the Flood Hazard Area Control Act rule, the state reviews that application. What has generally happened, and Vince and I can debate this a little bit, but what my observation is, what has generally happened is a local official will defer to the judgment of the state. And while the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, requires a local ordinance and certain standards, the local official will be, hey, the state's okay with this. They did a thorough review, so we're kind of good with this. That's kind of what I've observed. To compare that with the whole retreat aspect of what's going on in New Jersey, that very much is a local thing. And we do see a great range of proactive communities in terms of mitigation, and then other communities that are just not really doing anything with mitigation. I would say the riverine communities are your ones that have been doing things. Woodbridge is your example. While I believe part of Woodbridge does experience tidal flooding as well, but it's your more inland communities are doing much more. Now, I talked about, we had a Sandy, and everyone knows Hurricane Sandy, but we also had all of these other storms. And I think a number of towns got hit twice, maybe 3 times. And that means I call it getting religion. It's like someone starting to say, you know, this is a problem, we need to do something about it. My own town included. I'm in Lambertville and on the Delaware River. And when we had the 05, 06 event, we then had the 2011 event, we then had Ida, which was a flash flooding event. But flooding is people really understand we're going to get more floods in my town. So so from the retreat standpoint, on the coast, but I think that's going to change. And I put this slide, my one slide is, I put this slide in here. This is Dow Jones marketplace and market watch, excuse me. And this is going to change minds. This is starting to happen. You may have also heard about recently insurance, and this is, you know, in wildfire, movie areas, wildfire, urban interface, urban out west. We're seeing certain insurers not selling new policies. We're seeing insurers jacking the rates up. Reinsurance is super expensive now. That's the insurance for insurance. Very, very expensive, getting more expensive. They've been losing money as an industry, so they're jacking their prices up. But I really see these kind of things disrupting things. And while, yes, of course, regulatory, very important, both at the national, state, and local levels, I also see this kind of thing happening, which is basically the markets are starting to react to these things. You're going to have municipalities that are starting to feel the effects of these, that, you know, the tax base, the property values are going to start experiencing changes according to market conditions. So I just want to throw that out there. I will talk about that some more, I think, later. But municipalities, you know, a credit rating for a municipality is obviously setting what their costs of basically borrowing is when they issue a bond. It's also it's bragging rights. If your credit rating is higher, you can see municipalities celebrating that and saying, look, we have good governance here. Re-elect me. We've got a good credit rating here. It means more than just a monetary value. It's a pride thing. It goes down to pride. And I really think you're going to start seeing that as well. And when you issue debt, you have to start answering questions, and the bond rating agencies are starting to get smarter. They are acquiring analytic companies. They're not just like partnering with them, they're buying them. They're bringing them into their credit rating agency. They're going to start asking better questions than they've been asking in the past. They weren't asking great questions. They're going to start asking questions knowing some of the answer that they want to hear back. So the communities are going to have to start anticipating those questions and having good answers to those questions. So yes, thanks.
Thanks, John. I think you queued up a lot of themes that we'll be coming back to in the next question rounds, but Eric, do you want to reflect on this broader context first?
Yeah, let me talk about something we're not doing such a great job on, and how it relates to this conference. So I talked about I'm responsible for pre and post disaster mitigation grants. Also, the minimum standards of the National Flood Insurance Program. How many certified floodplain managers do we have in the room? Just curiosity. Okay, I have a few, a handful. How many folks have heard about something called substantial damage, substantial improvement? Okay, good. So that is part of the current minimum standard that every community has to apply to. This came into play very big here in New Jersey, New York after Sandy. And frankly, I think we could have done a better job collectively. When I say collectively, it's federal, state, local government. What substantial damage really means is when a house has a certain amount of water, and we have training on this, there's a calculation, I won't get too technical, but generally when a house gets around 3 or 4 foot of water in it, it becomes substantially damaged. That means that the damage of that house exceeds 50% of the pre-market value of that structure. Why is that important? That is the trigger by which that structure then needs to be mitigated. What is mitigated? Elevated, torn down or reconstructed, or acquisition. So that is our big trigger in the National Flood Insurance Program for changing the profile of the floodplain. We haven't done such a great job of adhering to substantial damage. There's a lot of pressure at the local level to get kids back into schools, to get people back into their homes. And, you know, a lot of communities sometimes, especially with the local politics, you know, the floodplain manager who is responsible for that sometimes has conflict with their elected officials who want people back into their homes. This is a real challenge. We saw this after the floods in, you know, Baton Rouge in Louisiana. We saw it after Harvey. We're seeing it now in Florida, you know, Lee County and the areas that were hit after Hurricane Ian. So collectively, this is where we need to do a better job of mitigating those structures. This is the enforcement part of FEMA. And so we are trying to do more training. We have a substantial damage playbook. We're providing more technical assistance for local officials, but also holding those communities accountable. And we have a lot of challenges. I was just down in Florida a few weeks ago, and we had a FEMA employee who showed us his home and had about 4 foot of water in it. And he got a substantial damage declaration he had to go into the local town and ask for it. And I'm looking at his neighborhood, and people are in their homes and the recycle bins are at the corner. And like, this is a lost opportunity. This is the opportunity to mitigate those homes, to get them elevated, to reduce the risk profile, to get those potential properties acquired if that risk is there. That is an area we need to do a better job. Talking with the state hazard mitigation officer in Florida, she was telling me that some of those local communities, this is the bridge between floodplain management and grants. Some of those local communities do not even want to offer mitigation options to their homeowners because it's too hard. You know, knocking on doors, trying to figure out who wants to elevate or acquire their home. If that community is not going to offer that option to that homeowner, and if enforcing substantial damage is a challenge, how are we changing the profile of the floodplains in our country? So that's something that's on, you know, FEMA to provide that leadership at the state and local level. We actually help pay for state floodplain managers. We provide training for local floodplain managers. But this is something we need to do a better job of. I've been committed to it, improving our workforce, holding communities accountable, and it's going to be tough because we get elected officials pretty upset, members of Congress, and they complain to my boss, my big boss, the FEMA administrator. This is something that gets written about quite a bit, but this is an area where we collectively, federal, state, and local, need to do a better job of breaking that cycle of loss. We're not doing those homeowners any favors by allowing them to go back into a home that we know is going to be flooded in the future. Let's get those homes mitigated. So that's an area. I wasn't sure I was going to bring this up, but talking about, you know, development in the floodplain, letting people go back into a substantially damaged home is not improving our risk profile for that community, for that homeowner, or for the country overall.
Thanks, Eric. That's such a crucially important point, and I especially appreciate it being so near hurricane after hurricane. Linda.
Thanks. I'm going back to still reflecting on this more broadly as tensions between our structures and our agency. I think that's what your maps are really contending with. So when you're talking about the broader context that retreat is taking place in, I'm thinking about just how much can we change given the structures that exist around us. And on the one hand, there's so much promise, and that's why we're all here, because we believe in the agency of all of us to make good choices and better choices. And if we convince people and good people are in leadership, then we can do a better job. And I'm kind of thinking that, like, in some of these cities like Ithaca or Cambridge or Boston or New York or Rutgers, you have some of the top planning schools, and they're all going into government in their local places. So there's lots of good planners in those places. So that should mean that those places have the best performing floodplains, and that's not the case. So something is a disconnect between the structure and the agency where, yes, agency matters, good people matter, but on the other hand, there are some big structures that are affecting and constraining a lot of our cities from those 24% from doing better. So what I tell my students is how I understand this framework that we live in, the national framework for land use planning in this country, such as we don't have a national land use plan, but the other pieces that add together, there is zero relationship between land use planning and our natural hazards. So at the very national level, FEMA, Army Corps, they come up with big money dollars. Here's a dam, here's a levee. You can live anywhere you like and you can be safe. And then we have states that are supposed to do land use planning because they have the land use powers, but mostly if you look at Caitlin Dykeman's 2014 paper, where she actually reviewed which states use which kinds of instruments, except for New England, most coastal states are very permissive in what they allow. They permit you to build a seawall. They permit you to build all sorts of things, a groin or other things. Very few places allow you to actually do green infrastructure. They say you can do, except to say dune restoration, you could do that basically, which means you're dredging sand. It's a green solution, but it's basically a gray solution in a different form. And then they delegate it to local governments. Local governments, we also say you should plan. Some local governments plan, some of them don't. But we also fiscalize our land use by saying that since we have fiscal stress at the national level, we put it down to the state levels, they push it down to the local level, and local governments actually have to pay the bills. And the way they pay their bills is through property taxes and user fees and charges. And all of those things require more people to move into their municipality or for their municipality to get richer so their land values increase and so their tax base is increasing. And then if you were to try to control them and change it, you get sued for takings of various kinds of one way or another. So municipalities don't like to change it. And if a disaster hits you because you made all the wrong choices, lo and behold, the federal government is going to come back and pay you 75 cents on the dollar. So why would you invest beforehand and pay 100% when you can come back later and pay 25%? And even if you didn't, people have insurance. So the private sector or the public sectors, they take care of that. And if you really just were, you're poor, you're black, all sorts of things, you didn't have insurance and nobody's going to come and help you. Thank God you moved somewhere else. New Orleans couldn't have been happier to like lose 100,000 black people and that never got to move back, right? So there's so many different factors that constrain it. And we are, as a system, really telling our municipalities, you have every incentive not to do the right thing and every incentive to do exactly what you are doing. So look at New York. They're still zoning and building big towers on the waterfront. Look at all of these places. So there's and then municipal fragmentation and cutting up the land so that you can't, like, how could a small municipality make a different choice? So I think that on the one hand, I think that good people can make good choices, but there are a lot of things that at the federal level, I would like to see that federal government take a leadership and state government do leadership on the things that they do control in setting our policies so that municipalities could actually do the right thing. And then the last comment I'll say is I'm reflecting on this idea of retreat as being a very difficult or challenging thing. How can we achieve retreat? But if you look at like the history of this country, there's been huge demographic shifts over time, industrial shifts that, people moved to Florida, people moved to Arizona, people moved to California, people left New England. Those are big shifts. There's white flight, we don't want to live in the inner city. There's a lot of ethnic diversity moving in. And so we're going to move. Like, these are things that happened and they happened on a large scale. So whether or not we are supporting, whether we are actually paying people for the loss of their property, demographic change is going to happen. And I think the real challenge we're struggling with here is that we actually have some aspirationally higher standards this time, that we care about equity, we care about community well-being, we care about sustainability. So we don't just want the complete market tendency to be able to do this, to lead us down that path, because even if we did nothing, the change is going to happen. And so the question is, what can we do to make that change be more equitable and have a better ecological outcome?
If you haven't read Linda's papers, I highly recommend it. Read them all. Okay, we're going to do one more question round up here at the panel. And for the panelists, I'm just going to go ahead and combine rounds 2 and 3 to make sure we have some time for audience questions. And this next question set is going to build exactly from one of the themes that Linda was working with, which is what are the incentives and disincentives in connecting retreat and land use planning and flood risk management more broadly. I'm going to just pick up one theme that John mentioned. So John was emphasizing that in New Jersey, there is a very big, proactive, ambitious role of the state, linked to some of Linda's discussions of structural factors and the degree to which we see difference across the US as a whole. So in this theme of kind of what can happen at the local level, what can happen at the federal level, what can happen at the state level, I'll just mention one statistic that came out of this study that has had, for both siders and me, our jaws kind of dropping. So we counted up every single home that has gone into a floodplain in any of America's communities over the last 2 decades. And almost half of those homes that went into the floodplain went into floodplain in Florida alone. Really an amazing, breathtaking result, and really points to the fact that we have a lot of difference across the US, even though some of these structural factors will be universal. Others are going to come down to what's happening at the state level and how that shapes the option set at the local level. Okay, so what are the incentives and disincentives in connecting retreat and land use management, flood risk management more broadly? What are barriers and enablers at the local level? And what are carrots and sticks available at the state and federal level? And feel free to reflect on any tools and approaches that you find most exciting. We can either do the same order or whoever's most excited. What do we want to do? Okay, Vince is clearly jumping out of his seat here, so we'll stick with Vince.
I'm always ready to talk. You just ask my family. Yeah, so having worked in the regulatory side of things in the state for a long time, you can certainly disincentivize someone from doing something. You can make it harder for them. You can prevent them in some instances from doing it. So we have pretty big sticks, not a lot of carrots. It's very hard. Like if let's say you're in a community and half of it is in the floodplain and half is not in the floodplain. How do you convince that community to change the zoning to make the area that's outside the floodplain more attractive? You know, people in that area don't want there to be an incentive to further develop that area. You know, the Jersey coast is a good example, right? You've got intense development right along the coast, and then you go just a little bit inland and there's very little development comparatively. So how do we, if people are going to retreat, they have to retreat to a place. Where are they going to retreat to? They want to be near the water, and water is attractive to them. How are we going to incentivize communities to do that? Because on the state level, we can't dictate to a community, you shall have your development here, and you definitely cannot have it here. I mean, we have the state plan, we have some tools, but a lot of it goes down to the local level. And the state has been, I think New Jersey has been pretty successful at making sure that the things that are in floodplains or that will be eventually in floodplains are built to a certain higher standard, but that doesn't incentivize people to leave unless it's more expensive. And I've had this conversation with a number of folks too. They've said, well, the land, I've been told this, I haven't researched this, but been told this, that a lot of times the land, if let's say you're buying a piece of property that's not developed, the land that's clearly in a floodplain might be devalued from a land that's not, right? Development on those two lots, like what can you sell the building for? There's so many different factors. And to John's point, the economics of it, I think, is really probably what's going to be one of the biggest factors that we encounter.
Thank you, Vince. And we'll go up our scales of governance again here and turn to John.
Yeah, so again, we need regulations, and whether it's at the state level that Vince oversees, or it's what Eric oversees at the federal, and that cooperative federalism is what we call, the NFIP, where it's, the federal government sets some standards, the states may set some standards, the local have their local ordinance, and that all needs to jive, and it doesn't always do so, but it's a great concept. But I want to go, and Vince alluded to it, no surprise. I'm going to go back to the market forces thing and talk about not just credit rating, which again, I've touched on already, and I've already mentioned insurance, but I'm also going to mention lenders. There was a 2019 paper released as a series of papers from the San Francisco Federal Reserve. And the author used the term blue lining. And I don't mean, I really want to avoid that this is not redlining. This is, but the term sort of rings a bell in terms of, it sounds like redlining. But we're going to start seeing, and we're starting to often see in the insurance sector, areas where it's just not worth it. Why would you, as an investor, why would you, as a business, go into certain areas where you have too high a risk? Some of this could be controlled. State insurance commissioners might be like, no, you can't leave there, or you need to have a certain percentage of that, or in the auto industry, there's a certain number of high risk drivers. There's a pool of that, and they get insurance companies to cover that. But at some point, it's just not going to be business. It's not going to be good business to have investments in certain areas. And I think that's really what's coming. And I think that will exceed the political will for the necessary regulations we can do. We'll do them to a certain point. But my experience, and I've worked as, I've been an expert witness on development projects, different things. Developers will find a way. They always find a way. They always find a way to build. And I just think at some point there's just going to be these business decisions that it won't be worth it. I also want to mention that we need to start, when we talk to communities, we need to start using their language. We need to start talking about budgets. We need to talk about capital improvement plans. We need to use the language that communities use. I just stepped off, but I was 18 years on a local planning board. And I learned a lot there, and you'd be really surprised on who's sitting on those land use boards, whether they're zoning boards or planning boards, and the experience they do or do not have. And the decisions that are made at, 11 o'clock at night, midnight, the last one, and this is one of the reasons why I stepped off. Our planning board, and this was a project close enough to me that I hadn't recused myself, but that decision was made at 3 o'clock a.m. in the morning. All right. But we need to start considering these things. We need to start thinking about it. Tax base, they're really hyper focused on their tax base. They're ratables is the word we use in New Jersey. Okay, I guess that's a colloquial term in New Jersey, but we talk about ratables and the ratable chase and the ratable, ratables are going to solve it all. We need to talk about that revenue and operations and that balancing of things, the budgeting and the funding, bonding, and all this stuff. We need to start using that language and understanding how they think about the world. And that's basically, I think that while that's not an incentive necessarily, but we need to start adapting to the conversations that the local governments. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. We will go Eric, then Linda, then Siders, just as a heads.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. So, when I saw your slide about the number of new, homes in Florida, the next thing that comes into my mind is how many of those properties have flood insurance. I look at the community resilience pathway and, we've seen overall, you are required to have flood insurance in the floodplain, but what happens is people drop that over time and their bank doesn't check, and then they get hit by a disaster. And we see communities that have like a 10, 20, 30% penetration rate of flood insurance in the floodplain. And then that homeowner, they end up in our individual assistance program, which the average payout is like $7,000 or $8,000. And if they had a flood insurance policy, it's like $120,000. So I immediately think about flood insurance, looking at FEMA's the largest flood insurance provider. We're tasked by Congress of doing that. I think we had about 5.1 about a year or two ago. We're down to 4.8 million policyholders, roughly. Don't quote me on the exact number, but all this new development in the floodplain, do they have flood insurance? That's the big thing. And last thought. Actually, I totally forgot what my last thought was. So we'll come back. But flood insurance is definitely. I know what it is real quick. The minimum standards of the NFIP. I mentioned that just briefly. We're relooking at that now. Now, please, especially if there's press here, make sure I choose my words carefully. We put out a request for information. We got public comments back. So some of the public comments that we got back, and these are part of the public record, is part of the minimum standard. There should be no development in the 100-year floodplain. We should be regulating to the 500-year event. We should have 3 foot of freeboard. We should have no fill in floodplains. So these are some of the comments we got back that we're currently going through. So in terms of where that all goes, I think definitely pay attention to that, because if we do move forward with that, that could potentially change the minimum standards for all 22,800 communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And depending on what we propose, that could be it'll go up for public comment. If we choose that route, so you'll all see it, they have a chance to comment on it, but that could be pretty substantial. If we haven't changed it in 40 years, it could potentially, based on the comments we received, there were some pretty bold provisions proposed by a lot of you.
Great points, Eric. Linda.
A few comments. I wanted to react to some of the things that John is talking about, the importance of private sector participation and what the market is going to do. And so on the one hand, we absolutely need the private sector to take action because they control most of properties, they control most of the financing and the development. But private sector entities are fundamentally governed by a concern for profit and liability. So they're going to maneuver themselves to reduce their financial liabilities and then to maximize the profitability. And that is a very different set of priorities than what communities care about or what households care about. There was an exceptionally alarming presentation in this room yesterday afternoon by Climate Alpha. I would say that was the single most important presentation in this entire conference. Thanks for Hannah Tiger for inviting him. If you can watch it or get the slides later, I cannot recommend it enough, but it was just incredible what the combination of AI and finance is doing, because they are very incisively calculating where they should invest. Great, good for them. But that is going to tank certain municipalities. It's going to implode the speculative markets in other places and affect financial affordability. And if governments don't get ahead of that, the market is going to just redesign the same system, but in a slightly more climate adaptive way. So super, super important. I think one comment I would say is like the federal government in terms of incentives and disincentives. One thing that like we are seeing $1 billion come out of the federal government right now. There is no thesis as to where that money should go. It's entirely based on competition and grant making along various sets of criteria. For instance, does the federal government think that we can sustain in the long term for the next 50 or 70 years population growth in Arizona, California, and Florida? If it does, then please make your investments there. But if it's climate science, like it's national climate assessments and various things, think that that is not a good place, should those same places also receive the same amount of federal investments as long as they write a good grant? Should you be able to invest in coastal infrastructure if many aspects of climate science is saying that seawalls of various kinds are not good for the environment, they will fail in the long term. But if a community writes a really good proposal for why it's justified to have a seawall for their particular community and their state allows it, the federal government, I bet, would still go ahead and pay for it. So this is a huge wasted opportunity with $1 trillion that is going down that is not necessarily following all of the things that we are talking about in the conference. So it's not just about like here's a moment of incentives and disincentives where withholding money would be just as powerful as actually having any kind of policy change. And then I'll say like a lot of the things that we care about around equity and around action and collective action. I think it's really this question of collective action is a lot about boundaries that we are drawing, boundaries at the parcel level and boundaries at the municipal level. And so the question is, how can we expand some of those boundaries so we can open up policy options? So there's a lot of talk, and Siders is a lawyer, you know, it's like if you're talking about coastal retreat, right? If it's public trust doctrine and the state or the federal government, the public owns the water and the private owns the land. So as the coasts are retreating, either you preserve the public right to the beach, in which case the private loses the land, or you preserve the private's right to land by letting them have a seawall and then the public loses the beach. So there is no happy answer there because somebody's going to lose. But if you were to draw the boundaries differently on land and said, we share this amount of land collectively, whether that's a block or multiple blocks or multiple towns, and you were to actually allow to reorganize yourselves, there is plenty of space for housing and coastal communities and resiliency and landscape, but it cannot happen if we are always bounded by the same kinds of boundaries that we have drawn under a climate static condition. So that goes ultimately to questions of municipal incorporation, of property rights, that we don't allow. The Stafford Act does not fund co-ops, much less CLTs. Like if you have any kind of condo structure, it does not permit it. So it's very predicated on individual property rights and notions of property fundamentally as a land relations. With our municipalities, New Hampshire is the first state to have passed a legislation that allows 2 coastal municipalities to merge or otherwise incorporate in order to deal with sea level rise and other coastal climate impacts. And that's going to allow them to make different kinds of choices than if each municipality is going to pile its last remaining development on its last little bit of high ground and then link them with drawbridges in some future scenario. So those would be some of my advocacy points of like pluralism in the way we think about property, to allow for collective action at a policy level, to disincentivize by withholding money, and to pay attention to what the private sector is doing and get in front of them.
I don't want to follow that.
And let me just say, get ready for your questions. So we'll close out after Cider's remarks. So those of you who jump up with your hands first will get called on after Cider goes.
We skip to that. No, that was so eloquently put. I guess you mentioned Arizona, and I've been thinking a lot about Arizona. People have seen in the news, right? Arizona not allowing new development in Phoenix until people can show that they have, or until developers can show they have access to water, right? Because this idea that like, why would you let people build in a desert if they don't have any water? And I keep thinking, why do we let people build in a floodplain if we don't have any plan to keep them safe, right? And I think there's something important here, and on many different levels, I've been thinking about sustainability of towns, right? Now, if the future viability of your town relies on FEMA providing 75 cents on the dollar every time you have a disaster, if it relies on the perpetual growth of the value of homes that are sinking into the ocean, this might not be a sustainable model, right? This is not a sustainable place. And so I keep thinking about this idea of sustainability, but what does it mean to be a sustainable, a viable town, a viable community in the long term, right? And how are we thinking about that from, okay, we're allowing development. I think it was Maine has some rules like sand dune rules, right? Where when you build a new home in certain areas, you have to show that your home will be on stable ground 100 years from now. And you can't use a seawall to make that proof. And I think that's really interesting in that it puts the burden of the proof on the developer to show that like we're building here because we have land. The same way we put the burden on the developer to show I have access to water, you would have access to, right, stability or something. And I keep thinking about this with these towns. How do we think about, to your point on where should we invest? Does it make sense to continue to invest in some of these places? Does it make sense? Are they viable? Are they sustainable? Right? Because if the coast is truly such an amazing, right, tourism economic driver, then probably should also be able to fund some flood mitigation efforts in that town. And if it can't, then I have to wonder, right? Why is your town only viable with continued injections of outside funding? Why is it the conversation at this conference is so much about we need more federal money? We do, sure. But why isn't it also about other sources of funding? Why is it all about maintaining the ratables instead of thinking about, does it make sense to have local governments that are perpetually funded by a private sector market that we are artificially propping up the prices of by like concealing flood risk disclosure and things like that, right? So anyway, so I'm thinking about this in this context of retreat, right? Because I'm forgetting who made the comment yesterday, right? But we're building out all these homes and many of these homes will have to retreat in the future, but there's no plan for that. And so I do think that that's interesting. We have the technology to build modular homes. We have the technology to build homes that, sure, maybe it makes sense to build a home and let someone live there for 10 years and to have a plan for that home to be demolished and taken off the beach and not to become debris, right? Thomas Rupert was speaking about that the other day, right? Like we have the ability to do that if we think it makes sense to have something here in the short term, but not the long term. But it requires us to think about both short and long term. And so I think when we're thinking about these incentives and we're thinking about retreat in this larger context, I like the way people have framed it as we need to think about the new buildings that are going in. We need to think about when we allow rebuilding better and when we don't allow rebuilding or when we don't allow new building in the future. But I think it does require some of this longer, harder look at the idea that not every town that existed 100 years ago exists today. Did a camping trip in Pennsylvania through abandoned towns, right? They don't exist. Not every town that exists today will exist in 100 years due to sea level rise or technology change or something else. And as you say, I really loved your line on like, we're aspiring to do better. So let's aspire to do better, but that's going to require some really hard conversations about not every place is going to be saved, but which are, which aren't, and how do we think about doing that in an equitable and better way?
Okay, so someone online was really clever and put their question in first. So we're going to go with the online question. And then I think I saw hands here, here, and here. So we will maybe take 3 questions from all of you and then let the panel react to them. Online question, is the FEMA National Violation Tracker data publicly available? Probably to Eric and John.
No. I don't think it is.
I don't think it is. Yeah, I think our insurance director has that. I think it's because of the personally identifiable information, which would violate the Privacy Act. So like,
Privacy Act.
yeah, you couldn't go in and look at somebody's home, your neighbor's home and see if they had a negative. Yeah, it's protected by the Privacy Act.
Is there anything at like an aggregate level people could access? Like violations by state or anything?
That I don't know.
There have been communities that have been asking for this. And when they get their community assistance visits and other things. I think that is somewhat shared, but I don't believe it's publicly accessible.
And FEMA probably does not want me to be saying this, but you have been incredibly responsive to researcher FOIAs, so that could be relevant to whoever is asking this question. Okay, I saw one, two, three. Oh, yeah.
Let me say, I'm detailed to the Senate Banking Committee. I wasn't going to mention this at all, but this idea of certain data being available to certain uses and certain, whether researchers or local floodplain managers, we're working. So anyway. That's all I'm saying.
Super, thank you. Okay, we're gonna have 3 people ask their questions and then just give the panel an opportunity to respond. That way we get a little bit more airtime from all of you. The first 3 hands I saw were right here. Is there a microphone we should be using? Whoever is in charge of that. This one?
Hi. My name is Ignacio Neri. I'm from the Master of Science in Sustainability Management of the Columbia School, and my background is on M&A and project finance on the infrastructure sector. So considering your rich background and expertise on hedging risk for properties, this is a question for each one of the panelists. Where would you buy land in the US to build your house? Where would you buy that land? That would be my question.
Wonderful. We're gonna hold that. Where would you all buy land? Great. Could you please hand the microphone to 2 people back? We'll hear her question as well.
Right? Oh, that's loud. So we know that those living in high flood risk areas tend to have either very high or very low incomes. Are there any conversations happening around equities, specifically about using the NFIP as a tool to disincentivize development in a floodplain for high-income homeowners, while slowing the flow of lower income domestic climate refugees who are forced to leave their homes by assigning flood insurance rates based not only on risk, but also on household income?
Excellent. Bring in income, and then we're gonna come over here and I'll.
Thank you. So I'm Dick Norton. I teach at the University of Michigan. I've studied coastal shoreline management. I have just a few more to complicate things even more. We've been studying shoreline dynamics, and I think planning consultants play a huge role in what's going on here. We've studied which are the communities that are doing a good job of planning for coastal management, and the ones that are using planning consultants are not. I think because the planning consultants don't deal with this on a regular basis. So there's a whole lot of education that needs to happen that way. I've been really struck by how little local officials understand shoreline dynamics, and they really don't understand the authority they have, and they greatly overestimate the fear of takings claims. I think they're much less likely to lose a taking claims than what they think they are. And I'm really struck how little municipal attorneys understand the takings doctrine and are paying attention. We have lots of folks in smaller communities, but most of the land area that's managing shorelines are really rural, small, low capacity communities. They don't have the bandwidth to be dealing with this, and they don't deal with it regularly enough to really be up to speed on it. So all of the planning stuff, it's all of these other institutional disconnects that I haven't heard talked about. And I'm just curious if you guys have thought about it in your work, and maybe that's something to pick up. The final thing I'll say is we did some impact analysis, fiscal impact analysis. What will happen if the storm hits? And huge numbers. Oh my God, scary. And they kind of, and then they just kept going. It's not, they're playing craps. Well, the benefit of having this development here is so strong, we're willing to take the risk that maybe the storm will hit or the property will go in. We just don't want to deal with it. So just all of these incentives are pushing in the wrong way. So I just thought I would further complicate with some other factors I hadn't heard talked about that might be worth thinking about. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So considering all of those themes, planning consultants, the dimensions of income and flood insurance and where you all would live, we'll just have anyone who wants to jump in whatever regard, go for it.
So I'll give a story. Before I put an offer on the home that I purchased back in 2002, in a town that I knew had flood risk, but we hadn't had the storms that we've had since I've lived in town. I went right to the library. We didn't have Eric has a lot of much better products now that we didn't have then. I went to the library and pulled out the flood insurance rate map, and I was like, okay, this is better than this is okay. I'm going to go forward with this. I wonder how many people do, and I teach a course at UPenn in floodplain management called Floodplain Management in a Changing Climate. And one of the first assignments I give the students is use your current address or some address you had in the past, or some, make something up or whatever, but go out and tell me what the flood risk is. And it's funny, some students are like, you're not giving us instructions on how to do that. I'm like, that's the whole point. But that's, going to the whole, where would I buy land? There are more resources now than there were as far as telling you risk, but you know what? I think a lot of people either don't use those resources, or I've always had and I love, this would be a great study, but people move around a lot now. They don't necessarily live right now where they grew up, and people miss those experiences in these places they are going to live. We're experiential. We're very, we make decisions based on what we've experienced. And I think the way we move around now, and families, are separated, and people just don't have a feel for what their risk is in the place where they live. So where would I buy land? I would look at a bunch of resources, but I might talk to some people in the area that I'm interested in to learn what am I not picking up in these tools and resources, and make a decision that way. I mean, it's like a due diligence process.
If I could add to that, so look at the name of the road. I live on Lower Creek Road. Should have been an indication that there might be a problem. So the next time I buy, now I'm on a flood zone, like I said, but next time I buy, I'm going for like Ridgeview Terrace or Hilltop Court, no Valley View Drive, Seaside Terrace, so. But it's to John's point, it's true. Many people don't understand the risk. The only time they've ever even heard of the 100-year floodplain. What is this 100-year floodplain? I'm going to be dead in 100 years. I've had conversations with people that said, well, when was the last big flood that we had in this area? 1955. Well, I'll be dead by 2055. And it's like, well, the flood doesn't just come every 100 years on a Tuesday. It doesn't work like that. But people don't know until somebody tells them, usually their lender, oh yeah, you're in the flood zone. You need flood insurance. What? How could that be? I can't even see the stream from where I am. The river is a half a mile away. So it's a lot of it. And in New Jersey, we've been going back and forth with some better disclosure laws, because like when I bought my house, or when I put an addition on my house years ago, the town didn't even ask me if I was in a flood zone. And, I showed them, like, I'm not in a flood zone, by the way, but, you should be asking these people these things, but they didn't. But that's a lot of it. Like when we bought the house, they didn't have to disclose whether there was flood damage or, anything around us. So I think that will help a lot in New Jersey.
I want to jump in on this one. So I have the easy answer, because I would buy land in Duluth, Minnesota, not because it's a climate haven, but because it's my hometown. Yeah, so I get the cop out here. But I feel like I have to bring it up because people talk about Duluth, Minnesota as a climate haven, which I mean, yeah, sure. On the one hand, so there's no place that's perfectly safe, right? I mean, we've seen the wildfire smokes. We all know, we know this. No place is perfectly safe. Climate change is going to affect everybody. On the other hand, if you believe, and the science shows, right, that some places will be hit first and hardest, the logical corollary is that some places will be hit last and least. Yes. So there are places, whether it's directly outside the flood zone, or whether it's someplace with fresh water, or whether it's whatever, that will be hit less urgently, less quickly. But a lot of it is about the risks that you are willing to take, right? Like, are you willing to take the chance that you will get hypothermia or frostbite on your cheeks on the walk to work because it is negative 60 degrees? If not, Duluth might not be for you. Right? I mean, my high school had more days closed down because we were negative 60 than we did because of snow, because it is too cold to snow. That's a phrase my Florida roommate didn't know existed. Right? Whereas I was like, you have alligators in your backyard. That is not a risk I'm willing to take. You know, like coral snakes, not something I want to engage with on a daily basis. So a lot of it is very personal. I mean, there can be it's very clear, concrete advice. I'm not trying to just be facetious. Like there's very concrete advice, like find your flood risk, look at the names of things, think about history of the place you know and the risks. But you also have to think really seriously about what are the trade-offs you were willing to make. Are you willing to shovel snow in the winter? Are you willing to deal with the extreme cold? Are you willing to do the extreme heat? Are you willing to kayak in and out of your house because it floods on the road or not? Some people are. I am not. Some of these are very personal preferences. And so some of it is going to be what are the risks that you are willing to accept for yourself and for your family and financially accept and so forth. And I think this is where flood risk disclosure and risk disclosure in general is so important to make sure people actually understand the risk that they're accepting as well. Because it's one thing to say 100-year floodplain. It's another thing to say 1 in 4 chance by the time you pay your mortgage, right? Which are the same statistic, but they sound really different. Anyway, so I think a lot of this is very personal. And so I would take Duluth, but it's because I'm willing to accept the risks that come with Duluth, not because I think it doesn't have risks, right? Those trade-offs are for me. And then I'm not going to touch the FEMA one, but I want to stay on the role of on the consultants and the authority they have. During our interviews in New Jersey, one of the things that really struck me is that champions play a big role, we found, in adopting a lot of this legislation. But after they adopt it, and I wonder if this was happening to consultants, I don't know, but I wonder. Champions played a lot of role in adopting this, but then the implementation is not champions, it's not leaders, it's not sexy, it's not in the news, right? It's just everyday street level bureaucrats doing their jobs day in and day out. And you need many of them across many different departments to just do the work, right? And some of it is the agency they had. You know, I mentioned the authority, they don't believe they had authority. I had a mayor in another town who's not doing so well, and I won't name them, tell me that floodplain management and floodplain, ordinance and land use development is not a local issue. Yeah, I'm not surprised they're not, they also have a tax incentive to build in the floodplain. But so I think there was a real difference we saw between some of the towns where people just felt the agency part of it. I mean, they still have faced the structural barriers, but they felt like this was something that was supposed to be their job and that they were going to do on a daily basis, and that this was their role, as opposed to the places who thought, this is a federal issue, this is a state issue, this is something that's out of my control. How could I possibly have taken control of this? So I do think that, I don't know yet, it's too small of a sample for us to say something, but I was really struck by those lines in the interview about the feeling of local government, about feeling empowered. And I think that's one of the reasons I find the flip in this narrative is really interesting, is that I hope that if we can actually show with enough statistical significance and accounting for these other factors that like many places are doing better than we'd expect, I hope that could empower other towns to think that this is something that is doable and to not feel so concerned that this is an insurmountable challenge. Because sometimes just knowing something is possible is a first step.
Wonderful. We'll go to Eric and Linda for closing reflections, and then we'll let you all get to lunch.
I'll make a hopefully quick work of your NFIP question. So I talked yesterday about, statutes, regulations, policy guidance. So by law, we are required, anyone that wants a flood insurance policy, we have to offer that policy to them. That's by law. We also are required by law to charge a rate commensurate with the risk of that property. So those are two things that are in statute. Now, to your question about, carrots and sticks, when grants come in, like to elevate a home, like our flood mitigation assistance program or BRIC, we do look at the social vulnerability of that area. And that's how we give points for an area that may have maybe a disadvantaged community, lower income houses, what have you. We also prioritize them for technical assistance. So when they come in for a grant, that's how we consider equity. But in terms of insurance, we are now what Congress has the ability to do. We've made legislative proposals, and they've frankly failed to do it. Is come up with an affordability framework for flood insurance. That is something that they are trying to tackle. We have a legislative proposal on how to potentially do that, but the affordability of flood insurance is something that Congress has to take action on. We don't have the ability to offer a voucher or discount on flood insurance without Congress giving us the ability to do that.
And Linda.
Great. So Dick's question, I'm going to ask it about, I guess I'll discuss it a bit about the fiscal health component, I think is what you're raising. this was something that I was also very interested in because I kept hearing from people, it's about the property taxes. Mayor doesn't want to give up the development, never talk about that house or the row houses. They're the most high value. So I was like, okay, just how much is being at risk? So we did some of these studies and they're, you know, for some towns, it can be quite significant. In Massachusetts isn't less. In Florida, it's like, wow, there's dozens upon dozens of towns for whom it's like 50% or more of their tax bases are at within 6 feet of sea level rise. And then we paired it with a survey that will, oh my God.
It's
Will Butler, and Tisha Holmes did of all the Florida municipalities. And we found zero correlation between the amount of fiscal exposure you have and your prioritization of sea level rise in your planning. So if I thought that, you know, municipalities care about their budgets and their risks, they definitely are not necessarily reflecting that. And one would hope that the states would care more because in many places, bankrupt municipality, that bankruptcy would roll upwards. But I think that in many places, states don't necessarily care about the long-term impacts to do anything about it either. But I think that would be the place to advocate for because a lot of these impacts for the municipality to want to crank down the competition forces for development in different places is just too high for any individual municipality to tackle without changing state rules on some of these things. And where would I buy a house? Well, if you paid attention to the climate alpha guide yesterday, according to AI, one of the top 10 counties in the country to buy, if you want it to rise in value and it's also resilient, would be Multnomah County, Oregon. And they calculated that in the top 10 zip codes, I think it was zip codes or counties. I think, oh, okay, well, whichever, one of those. The top 10 in the next 10 years would expect to experience an average growth rate of 46% in land value. So those would be excellent places to invest. I myself live very close to a gorge in Ithaca, which means I have a fantastic natural drainage channel very close to my house. And there are many hazards perhaps, but flooding will not be one of them.
Wonderful. I know there were a lot of hands up. So as we draw to a close here, for those of you with a really burning question, feel free to walk up after the close of the panel. But before that, I would really like to thank John, Linda, Siders, Eric, and Vince for a really tremendous set of reflections.